Hi everyone, Tracy DW here. The war in Ukraine is neither a million miles away nor hundreds of years ago. It provides a window through which we can see the devastating consequences of war and its effect on the human psyche through the breakup of families, the breakdown of societies, the death of loved ones and the physical and mental trauma caused by displacement. It also provides us with a study of the process of invasion and empire building in the modern world. We no longer have to rely on hindsight to evaluate the past, as we now have the advantage of witnessing events happening in the present. The blanket coverage of the media has humanised the experience of war, and I feel that my strapline is more prevalent now than ever before. Is history a matter of fact or perspective? It may be fact that presents the events minute by minute and second by second, but it is perspective that determines how events are portrayed and represented, from whose viewpoint is it told, and who actually gets to tell it, the victim or the aggressor. Whoever can control the narrative ultimately determines whose war it is and how history is written. Now, all war is an assault on human life and human dignity, wherever it takes place and to whomever it happens to. But over the last couple of weeks, many have said that there is indeed a contrast in how the war in Ukraine is being covered in relation to other conflicts, such as those in Syria, Yemen and Afghanistan. The terms war crime, refugee and migrant have become legitimised through this perception of Europe consisting of conflict-free civilised societies. The Migration Act of 1971 and the British Nationality Act of 1981 was Britain's response to its own complaint about being overcrowded and the agenda of the hostile environment, which stood for decades, has given way in just a few weeks to fast-tracking visas, because suddenly there is plenty of room on this small island. Does the war in Ukraine provide the opportunity for Britain to adopt the moral high ground and practice virtue signalling? Over the last few days, having watched video footage on news channels and on social media, one particular interview stood out. This was with a Congolese gentleman, a student who was studying in the Ukraine. He told his account of how he, like many other Africans and Asians, had been stopped at the Polish border and told that he could not pass into safety, but had to stay and fight for Ukraine. As I began to reflect on the interview, I asked myself, whose war is it anyway? It was uncomfortable to think that, even in the face of war, such racial bias exists. But if you look back in history, this bias is supported by a long-standing historical narrative driven by colonial activities and the expansion of empire by the West through their activities in exploring and invading of the lands of indigenous populations. So, whose war is it anyway? It is often, if not always, the case that Europeans settled their disputes about land and territory with each other through wars which drew in the involvement of indigenous populations. The ongoing instability that this has caused, even in the post-colonial era and up to the present day, has enabled the West to profit from peace, and therefore gave birth to the premise that war is the preserve of parts of the world where only people of colour preside, and it is an activity that people of colour are naturally prone to or predisposed to. Is this true? Whose war is it anyway? We can recall throughout history countless examples where Britain and other European powers have invaded and occupied countries where indigenous populations have suffered trauma, distress, displacement, and death, but these were not perceived as war crimes. They were perceived as a necessary process to not only exploit natural resources, but also to civilise these parts of the world, moving them away from religious, monarchy and tribal hierarchical systems and assimilate them into Western ideologies such as liberalism, nationalism or communism. Even though the consequences of these wars still remain today, it is easy for the West to dismiss them due to being beyond living memory and not on your doorstep. So, let's go back in time. European exploration claimed Canadian land first in 1534 with Jacques Cartier, and the process of French settlement building began around 1608 with Quebec City. Even though Canada and the Arctic North were some of England's first attempts at exploration to find a trade route to the Far East, England had never formally acknowledged a claim until 1583, when the settlements of Cupid, Ferryland and Newfoundland were established. The Scottish also began to settle there from around 1623. In Canada, the process of assimilation of the indigenous peoples with the West had its origins within warfare between the French and the British, as well as through the Indian Wars from 1688 to 1763, as it became more important to establish forts and ports due to the lucrative fur trade. The indigenous population became embroiled with this European dispute, siding with the French or English through trading agreements, which inevitably led to taking sides with one of the European nations. But whose war is it anyway? The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 saw the sale of vast areas of land in North America by the French to the newly formed 13 colonies. Although slavery of the American Indians ended in 1836, their collective removal and forced displacement by the US government was a gradual process that began from the early 1830s to the 1850s. This process affected some 60,000 Indians across 5 different tribes who lived and thrived as autonomous nations in the area now known today as the Deep South. The Indian Removal Act in 1830 removed all rights that the Indians had to their ancestral lands, forcing them to move west of the Mississippi River. A journey which took the form of many routes which were collectively called the Trail of Tears, and by 1838 around 100,000 acres of land was made available for European settlers. Whose war is it anyway? By the early 1840s, England's interests in Africa increased immensely when men such as Henry Morgan Stanley, David Livingstone and Cecil Rhodes began to explore the south-central part of the continent's interior. Stanley charting the river through the Congo Basin, Livingstone establishing a missionary base for the Church of England, and Rhodes' establishment of the South African Company, which later exploited the diamond mines in southern Africa. These men represented Britain's growing interests in the same part of the African continent that the Portuguese wanted to lay claim to, and this created a conflict between the two European nations. The Pink Map Project was created in 1885 by Portugal's then Foreign Minister, Barros Gomes, and was Portugal's attempt to counter Britain's claims and convince other European nations such as France and Germany that their claim to the land was valid. This stretch of land is what we today now call Malawi, Zambia and Zimbabwe. However, European interest in Africa reached its peak in the scramble for claiming land on Africa's continent, appropriated through the Berlin Conference held in Berlin in 1884 to 85. A British ultimatum in 1890 saw the withdrawal of Portuguese troops, and an agreement to draw up territory saw a compromise between the two nations. But what were the experiences of the indigenous populations of those southern African lands? And what were the consequences for them? Whose war was it anyway? Even more recently, over the past century, European countries have turned on one another, bringing a global network of countries into their arguments in 2 world wars. On both occasions, it has been mainly due to disputes about territory and tension between rival alliances. In this case, the Triple Entente, Britain, France and Russia, versus the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary and Italy. The build-up to the Great War of 1914 to 18 saw the unification of Germany and an increase in their industrial and naval output, which was mirrored by a gradual decline of Britain's control of the rest of the world's industrial output. The assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in June 2014 sparked a chain reaction that by August of that same year saw a local dispute morph into a full-scale European war. The Versailles Treaty in 1919 only served to fuel further German discontent with its imposed sanctions. The Munich Agreement, drawn up between Germany and the Allied powers in 1938, was thought to appease Hitler with the acquisition of territory that was then called Czechoslovakia. But British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain had wrongly claimed to have achieved peace in our time, and a Second World War broke out in response to Germany's invasion of Poland the following year. The war from 1939 to 45 was different in that it was truly global in its reach, as several British and French colonies were called upon to join the Allied forces, while other countries aligned with the Axis powers. Whose war is it anyway? This time the war played out in the arenas of Europe, North Africa and the Pacific, and only 11 countries didn't take part. Who were they? What was also different about this war was the widespread killing of civilians within urban areas across countries and being bombed in order to weaken the infrastructure and torment the enemy into surrendering, and the dropping of the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, which not only ended Japan's imperial aspirations, but also brought the end of the war. The lasting legacy of both these world wars has been a continuous pattern of destabilisation in many places outside of Europe, caused by decolonisation, which has left many former colonies in a type of limbo, unable to reconcile and connect fully with the glory of their past, yet trying to forge a future through partnerships with new allies that were once old masters. Within Europe itself, the legacy has also been the breakup of empires in the form of the Balkan states, with the fall of communism and the unification of Germany and the end of the Soviet Union. Does war only happen in certain parts of the world? Is war the activity of people of colour? If you take away the perspectives and just look at the events, what is history really showing us? In 2022, yet again, European countries have turned on one another, bringing a global network of countries into their arguments. For the third time, it has been due to disputes about territory and tension between rival allies, this time between NATO and Russia and its allies. At the time of recording this podcast episode, the outcome of the war in Ukraine still remains unclear, but we anticipate a negotiation, as all wars end in negotiation. When we look back over this time, we'll ask the question, whose war was it anyway? The difference this time is that both the victim and the aggressor have the opportunity to control their narrative. But will this war just become another chapter in history that future generations will simply look back on and learn about? Or will they avoid the mistakes that we have made and realise that it is more important to learn from it? If you liked this podcast, then stay on this listening platform and check out my other podcasts in relation to this one that also explores the theme of war and invasion, such as From a Whisper to a Scream, Canada's Secret History, the Louisiana Purchase of 1803 Expanded, and the Pink Map Project, The Ultimate Paradox. And don't forget what I call the heart and soul of the Stories to be Told movement, my stories or poetic narratives, Caribbean Wind, Caribbean Rush, Knights at the Round Table, the Berlin Conference 1884, which actually is the narrative that goes with the Pink Map Project, and Gone with the Wind, Macmillan's Speech for Change, and they're all available on the website in both ebook, Kindle and paperback formats. Feel free to like, follow and share us on social media. Just visit storiestobetold.com and click on to whichever social media platform you'd like to follow us on. And while you're on the website, don't forget to join our mailing list where you'll receive free samples of all 4 of our current titles. And you'll be entered into our prize draw where I'm giving away copies of the Aspiring Authors magazine, published to celebrate this year's Black History Month in the US, where I'm a featured author. That's it for another episode, and as always, it's a pleasure and a privilege to share my learning journey with you in this podcast series, and I encourage you to either begin or continue your own. History is a matter of fact or perspective. I'm Tracy DW, and this is a Stories to be Told podcast. Stay safe, stay well, stay blessed. Thanks so much for listening again, and I'll see you on the next